Welcome to another exciting class of international water law. Let's see, first of all, administrative. Hopefully everybody saw the email that I sent out where I switched classes around so that the deadline for all the case studies is now 1 week delayed. So I just want to make sure everybody's okay with that. If you did not get that email, please let me know and send me an email and somehow make sure that you're on the email list. If anybody has any questions on the case study assignments, also please send me those questions. I think I've received one question so far, and I just answered to everybody since I thought it was a pretty relevant questions to everybody, for everyone. So if there's any other questions, please let me know. Before we start, I was looking through the news the last couple of days, and a couple of articles caught my attention, and I thought I would just throw them out, see what you all think. Hold on. All right, these articles, let's see. There we go. California seeks to build one of the world's largest recycling water programs. In Israel, they're moving heavy on desalination, and then the third one is on whether we should subsidize alternative water sources, and they were looking particularly at rainwater harvesting. And I want to ask you guys, I mean, are we becoming so desperate that we have to go to all these alternative water sources? What's your opinion of what's going on in terms of our situation here in Texas, our situation globally? We're now looking, I mean, Israel right now, in the last, I think, 7 or 8 years, has gone from something like 5% of their water coming from desalination, and they're shooting for 100% of all drinking water and household water in the next couple of years or 10 years will become from desalination. I mean, that's a huge, huge revamp of their water system. California, obviously we know what's going on there, but they're now willing to talk about toilet to tap. That's what we're talking about here in terms of a recycling water program. We're taking wastewater, we're putting it through a process, through a system. Some of the process might involve pumping it, treating it, and then pumping it back into the ground and letting the aquifer do some more cleansing, and then pumping it right back out and putting it back on your table in your taps. And then rainwater harvesting, the idea where you can start collecting rainwater and maybe even subsidizing it to the extent that more people get involved in rainwater and use that as a source of water, whether for homes or for the gardens or agriculture or other sources. Is this desperation, or is this, what is this? What's going on?
Go ahead.
I think it's an indication that most people will not conserve, and I think that's a problem. Conservation is something that we all need to practice, but it is probably one of the hardest changes that can be made. But I think in many instances, the state of California is probably a good example. They were warned about water issues 25 years ago and sought to do nothing about it. So you do have, whenever you have a knee-jerk reaction like that, you get, all kinds of ridiculous programs that come in. But I still think that conservation should be absolutely a pillar of any water program.
So you don't believe we're involved in conservation, or we're doing enough in conservation right now?
Not at all.
And this is a substitute? This is a Band-Aid?
Yeah, it's a whole lot easier to spend money than it is to get people to change their habits and ways.
Okay. Anybody else? And you're right. This is a lot of money.
So
I was just going to say that
I see it also as like an innovation thing. I don't think like rainwater harvesting is not a lot of money actually, and it's something that could really benefit more rural areas and places that are in need of water, like sub-Saharan Africa. So I look at that as also innovation, and more money needs to be put into this type of research. Because
Okay.
by and large,
The article actually talks about, or it questions whether we should subsidize it, give tax incentives, or even some kind of payments to people who want to go into rainwater harvesting. So that's got to be
So
a
I
pool
believe
of money
we
that
do.
they're suggesting.
I believe we do. Like, I know in like certain parts of Texas, like they have subsidized some of like the government buildings to put like rainwater harvesting on their roofs. So
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Is
yeah,
that a good
I definitely agree that it
way
should
spending of our
definitely
money?
be subsidized.
Is that a good way to spend our money? In fact, the article here is the article that is on here actually suggests that it's a bad way to spend money because it's going to incentivize more water use at the expense of conservation. So I think this one article is in line with what the comment from Galveston earlier.
Hey, let me read something to you. In July 24th, Friday, July 24th, 2015, in the Houston Chronicle, State Board approves $2 billion loan for water projects. You look at the very back of it, it says, the board chairman complimented the projects and said officials had plenty of time to do much more efforts. We're not concerned about the fact that we didn't hit 20% in the first round for conservation. He noted a new version of the state water plan is set to be finished next year. There will be a lot more conservation in that. So always down the road, we're going to conserve. I hate to agree with George King, but I'm forced to.
I mean, should we be incentivizing conservation somehow?
The SWIFT water plan required that 20% of all those funds be spent on conservation. In their first go around, they spent $2 billion. They've loaned out $2 billion, and they haven't achieved the 20% of conservation. So conservation is a hard thing to get people to do, in my opinion. I don't know how you do it other than standing out there with a baseball bat.
Yeah, or raise the rates.
I raise the rates.
There you go.
I thought that would get your attention. I just wanted to point this out because these articles are out there constantly, and I'm seeing more and more of them about these alternative water resources and desalination and all these other plans in terms of how to make more water. And I wonder, somewhat in line with what you're suggesting, is this at the expense of conservation? And this is something that I don't think as a policy matter has been really addressed broadly. So I think this is a really fresh area for if anybody's looking for topics, conservation versus new sources of water. This is a really good opportunity, and it's something that is on the agenda of our state and many other states and many countries around the world. It really is a fascinating and a great topic. So, any other comments, any other thoughts about this?
I have a thought. I think it is looking down the road. This is planning for the future. All of these things should be plannings for the future. People should be given reason to want to conserve. That might be financial or whatever, but it's nice to have all of these techniques in your bag of tricks. Yeah. The people in El Paso at that K. Bailey Hutchinson Bureau desal plant, they use it as an emergency. They use it part-time to keep it functional. But the only time they've ever let it go, according to the folks I've talked to out there, the only time they ever let it go full bore was when they had a freeze. The pumps that pumped the water from the groundwater and where the rivers, they froze and they couldn't get any water. So it is a backup. It is a futuristic kind of thing, but it should not be. There needs to be controls on that. It's for the future. Yeah. It's not to just let us keep being wasteful with our water.
Yeah. Good. Anybody else?
I think there's an a big, huge economic component to it. the technologies that we're seeing, including desalination, for example, are becoming more affordable. We've been doing water management for years and years and years the same way. We have in Galveston, we have 100-year-old infrastructure that, pipes that need to be replaced. We can continue to do that, or we can look at ways to apply different technologies in affordable ways to water management overall. And to my mind, individual conservation is one key component. Industrial, agricultural conservation is a big one, particularly industrial in Texas. But I think the application of the different technologies and just trying to figure out where they are efficient and affordable is why you see brackish water desal plants in El Paso and you don't see one in Galveston and the Gulf of Mexico yet. But I think it's a much more positive statement than just we're not conserving.
Okay, good. I think that the discussion between conservation and new technologies or new water it's not a one or the other. I think it's going to be a sort of a comprehensive package, and it's also going to be very dependent on local circumstances. So in countries where you have adequate water resources, you may not be talking about new technologies. You may not even be talking about conservation. In places where you don't have adequate water resources, then you have to look to see what are the current efficiencies and what are the opportunities and the costs that relate to those opportunities for conservation versus new sources. And I think this is something that is starting to develop globally, although I do agree that the emphasis, at least right now, is on new technology and new water resources. And you see this at all these conferences you go to. There are dozens and dozens of conferences specific for new technologies and new ways to make water. And the conferences on conservation are usually relegated to, well, we characterize them as environmental conferences, not as a conference on water management, global water management, local water management. It's usually an environmental conference, and they're characterized very differently. Not always, but just something to think about, because I keep seeing these articles in here, and I think they're really interesting. And if you're interested in more of these articles are on my Twitter feed and on LinkedIn and so on, so you're welcome to, you can check them out. And there's lots more. There's lots more of these articles. All right. The last couple of classes, we really took a global perspective on water. We talked about all the bad things that are happening around the world in terms of water stress and water scarcity. We talked about diseases that are due to water problems. We talked a little bit about water conflicts. We talked about water rights versus water needs. I mean, this is really 30,000 foot level conversation. And we even talked about the value of water and the human right to water. So again, this is sort of a discussion that can occur anywhere around the globe at any time in any country. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to take a more local perspective today and start looking at specific river basins, because if you think about it, where are the negotiations actually going to happen? Where are you going to actually start to implement rules and regulations and agreements between countries? It's going to be over a particular transboundary river or aquifer. So keeping with all that global perspective we had in the last couple of classes, I want to now zoom down to our own backyard. So do a quick case study, quick discussion about the Rio Grande, then I'm going to ask you a bunch of questions and see what you guys think. So hopefully most of you know something about the Rio Grande. This is literally our own backyard. It's the river that starts in Colorado, flows through New Mexico, and then forms the border between Texas and the United States in general and the country of Mexico. It's a relatively large drainage basin. I think it's the second longest river in the United States. It forms more than half of the border between U.S. and Mexico. So that 1,250 miles is more than half the border between our two nations. We've got two countries, and this is looking at jurisdictions. Two countries, we have 3 U.S. states and 4 Mexican states that are interested in this particular river. We've got somewhere around, I think, 10 million people who live in the basin of the Rio Grande, and I'm talking the basin all the way from Colorado down to the coast. I think last numbers I've seen, just a little over 6 million people rely on the Rio Grande for its water, either for drinking or for irrigation in some fashion. And just in the El Paso Ciudad Juarez alone, we've got 2 million people right there, of those 6 million, just in a very concentrated location. Just one other point I should make here. Notice that the river is both contiguous and successive. So it starts in one country and then flows into the other country. So that's a successive river. But it's also a contiguous river because it creates the border between the two countries. And I want you to keep this in mind as you think about what rules apply, what laws apply. Should we have different laws or the same laws for contiguous versus successive rivers? Navigability. The river, I've seen stories where some people were talking that they were literally sailing ships at least as far as Rio Grande City and maybe even further about 200 years ago. And it varies because you have wet years and dry years. And certainly you can't sail all the way, certainly not beyond Rio Grande City. You've got all sorts of Lake Amistad and some other barriers in the way. But I've seen stories talking about, or at least anecdotal stories talking about people, and I don't know if they're sailing or just canoeing, kayaking, but they're going all the way up to El Paso and further. So talking about navigability, I mean, this is somewhat navigable, at least historically. Right now, if you can get past the sandbar on the coast, maybe you can get a kayak, canoe further upstream. It really depends on whether it's a wet year or a dry year. But the whole point of navigability is really in question. And in some years, when the sandbar is complete, and there's been a couple of years when the river never makes it to the coast, to the Gulf. Is that a river? When it doesn't actually drain into the Gulf. So that's something, another idea to think about when you think about the Rio Grande. The river, is it really a river all the time or only when it's flowing into the Gulf? Most of the basin lies in a desert climate, so the climatic issues are very important. Environmental issues are very important in terms of the habitats and ecosystems that are related to this desert environment. Most of the water that's being extracted from the river are going for irrigation. Some are going for domestic purposes. We don't have a lot of industrial activity except maybe along the Mexico border when we hit the regions near the Maquiladoras. But really, most of the water is going for irrigation here. One other thing to note, at least on the U.S. side where we have appropriations in all 3 jurisdictions, Texas, New Mexico, and Colorado, they follow a prior appropriation allocation mechanism for the river, for their surface waters. It's entirely appropriated. So any water that has been allocated to those 3 states in this river has been appropriated. There's no extra water left. Now, there is water that goes to Mexico under the treaty, but that's been already segregated out of the water that's been allocated to the 3 states. Some of the problems that we've been experiencing on this river, if you look at that top picture, that is the exact same location I think it's 2000, 2002, 2005, and 2010. And you can see the river moves. And so the problem of the meandering border can be a problem. And we've actually had to have a subsequent agreement with Mexico about the border moving and where exactly does the boundary stay with the river or does the boundary stay geographically fixed and then the river moves. And so we actually have an agreement with Mexico over this. But the migration of the river is an issue, or has been in the past. Drought, over-extraction, climate change. This has been a huge issue on this river. There's effectively, there's not enough water for everybody's uses, just not enough for all the purposes that we want to use it. Demand is exceeding supply, and it's getting worse now that we've got this long-term drought or climate change, whatever you want to call it. We just do not have enough water to meet our demands, and I don't know if conservation here would adequately respond to all the shortages that we keep experiencing in different segments of the Rio Grande. As a result of this, we don't have enough water for environmental purposes. In-stream flows is still a huge issue on this river. In Texas, we've tried to create an in-stream flow regime. It's still stuck in the administrative system and has not been implemented. As a result, we have all sorts of endangered species that are found nowhere else other than in certain parts of this river, and they don't always get adequate water. We have upstream, downstream disputes. Whose water is this? Water starts up, the flow starts in Colorado. Should Colorado get any kind of superior right to the water because it starts there? New Mexico is sort of in the middle there. They're both upstream and downstream. Texas and Mexico are upstream and downstream to each other. They're also downstream to those other U.S. states. So we've got a lot of upstream, downstream issues that become really critical when we're talking about water supply or the lack of or inadequate supplies. The growth of colonias, the maquiladoras, and it's not just on the Mexican side. We've got growth on the U.S. side. Population growth, cities are growing, and so we've got a lot of issues in terms of how do we meet the needs of development and sometimes unplanned development with regard to our existing supplies. Pollution is also a major concern all along the Rio Grande, especially on the U.S.-Mexico border. On the U.S. side, it's more regulated because we have the federal laws that regulate water pollution and water quality. But on the U.S.-Mexico side, we've got a lot of problems with untreated discharges, agricultural runoff, non-point source pollution, and so on. And we have the non-point source pollution, in fact, all the way up to Colorado, the ag runoff and so on. So we're creating a lot of health hazards in different segments of the river. People are drinking out of the river. People are using the water for agricultural purposes. They're using the water for other purposes, domestic purposes. So we have to treat the water, and that's increasing treatment costs. On the Mexican side, because of the lack of adequate resources, not all the municipalities on the Mexican side are treating their water, and so the water is going right back into the river untreated. Environmental degradation as a result of the pollution, as a result of development in general. And this is agricultural development, economic development, industrial development, all along the river, all the way up into Colorado. There's also numerous areas of very significant historical and cultural significance that are not being attended to. On the U.S. side, we've had all sorts of budget cuts for the Forestry Service and land management services and all these other services, and they're not being taken care of. And so that's a significant issue. Flooding, well, we've got the reservoir systems that are supposed to help with flooding, but it doesn't always work completely. And we've had some flooding problems in various parts of the river and so on. So these are some of the issues on the Rio Grande. And I want you guys to think about how do we on the U.S. side approach the Mexicans in terms of trying to address all these problems and all these issues that we have. And I don't want to just, I don't want the answer, well, let's negotiate a treaty. How do we get to that point of negotiating a treaty? What's the process that will take us to the point that we sit at a table across from each other? And what are all the different factors that we have to think about before we even get to the table. So let's start off with factors. What are all the different things that we would need to know or think about or consider?
Don't we already have a treaty with Mexico over the Rio Grande, the one in 1944, and how it's allocated that, and then the Colorado, and then another one?
We do. I want to put that aside because I want to use this as an example before we get even to negotiation. So let me ask you it in this way. What did we in the U.S. have to know before we sat down to negotiate the 1906 treaty and the 1944 treaty?
That there was an event that polluted a river in this case, and that we established the causation as being from there, so we can kind of...
Okay, do we need to wait for a pollution event and then establish liability before we even sit down to negotiate?
Not
I mean, it could.
But I'm guessing that originally maybe that...
Sure, it could be. It absolutely could be that happens. Yeah.
I think we need to know who from the United States side is allowed or has the authority to sit down to negotiate,
Okay.
whether it's Colorado or New Mexico or Texas. And
Jurisdictions.
Equal representation, or if it goes up to the House of Representatives or Congress or something.
What interest does Colorado have versus New Mexico versus the United States versus Mexico versus Chihuahua or Nuevo León or any of these other Mexican states? How does that fit into the picture?
I mean, if there's like disputes within each country, whether it's the Mexican states versus each other, and looking out for their best interest versus the United States
Okay.
looking for their best interest.
What would you have to know before we get to that point of figuring it out? You asked who has authority.
You have different jurisdictions because I know I was looking at something in Bulgaria and Greece and Turkey. There's a river basin that flows through all of them, and it starts out in Bulgaria, but Turkey, or maybe in Turkey, or it starts out in one of them, but the river floods. So wherever it starts, you don't have as much flooding versus downstream versus upstream. So the people who control the river upstream has, I would say, kind of an advantage in a way. So you'd have to look at who controls the river in what areas and can affect flooding and flow rates and things like that. So that's, I think, an important factor as well.
Okay, so who controls which segment of the river and controls them in what context? Controls them in the context of pollution, controls them in the context of flooding. Good, what else? Patrick, do you have something?
Oh, I wasn't sure if you were asking if the agreements would be binding on the different states. Is that where you were going?
Well, that's part of it. I mean, if we had an agreement between the U.S. and Mexico, would it be binding on the individual states in the U.S. and the individual states in Mexico? Don't take this for granted.
Yeah, but the important first step is who's going to be at the table and why are they there? By what? How legitimate are they to be at the table to talk about this?
Do you think that Colorado should have a seat at the table, or Texas as an individual state?
If you don't have them there, they're certainly going to work against trying to get anything done. They'll stymie it if possible. Or if I was a Coloradan and I was not invited to the negotiation, I'd do everything I could to stop you guys.
What about Nuevo León or Chihuahua or any of the Mexican states? Do you think they have the same perspective that you just described?
Depends on whose ox is being gored, and I bet every one of those states in both countries feel that they have a dog in that fight.
All right. But what about the internal legal makeup of those countries in terms of how water is managed in the U.S. versus how water is managed in the United States? Anybody have a sense of that? Who has the authority in Mexico for water management versus who has the authority in the United States for water management?
country versus a state? Like in the United States, Colorado has a slightly different water law regime for water rights allocation than New Mexico would, and then there's different particulars in Texas as well versus,
Okay.
I think in Mexico it's decided at the national level.
Yeah, in Mexico, it's much more centralized. I mean, the individual states do have some authority, but it's all authority that is given to them from the central government. In the U.S., it's almost the reverse. The Congress, the federal government, has decided not to decide, in effect, and has left water quantity allocation and water quantity management to the states. So this is one of the things that I want you to think about. Who should be at the table? Because on the U.S. side, you may have more players with a particular opinion than on the Mexican side. On the Mexican side, you may have each individual states with their own individual opinion, but because of their legal framework, it might be more unified because of the centralization. On the U.S. side, it's much more decentralized amongst the states. But there's a problem. Who's authorized to negotiate a treaty?
Federal government.
It's the federal governments. It's the U.S. State Department and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Mexico. So these are the kinds of things that you need to start thinking about even before you get to the negotiation table, and start thinking about who are the stakeholders, but who also has the authority. So on the U.S. side, maybe you do bring in Colorado, New Mexico, and Texas to the negotiating tables. Do you give them an actual voice, or are they sort of sitting behind the actual negotiator? And think about from a negotiation point of view, do you actually want 4 or 5, four people on the U.S. side with 4 different opinions, and maybe they haven't spoken together, trying to negotiate against a one unified Mexico?
Impossible.
For those of you that have any kind of negotiation experience, that's probably a recipe for disaster. The easiest way to negotiate is one-on-one. And when you're talking about bringing 5 different perspectives, it's going to really, really complicate it. So just something to think about in terms of what interests you have, who has the authority. What else? What other factors would you want to know before you get to the negotiating tables?
Well, one
Who's
major
going to
thing.
enforce the treaty?
Oh.
Enforcement, okay. So is it the? I'm sorry. Let me just finish. Is it the federal governments? Is it going to be enforced at the local level? Are we going to have some third-party enforcement mechanism? Some police, Swiss guards coming in to enforce? All right. I think somebody call a station.
I was going to say that it would be important to know how much water there is at the different locations of the river, because I know a lot of the data in the treaties is probably antiquated.
Yeah. Excellent. I mean, think about it. If you don't know how much water you have, how can you sit there and allocate it? If you don't have a mechanisms for literally counting water, and counting it maybe over a time period, maybe on a yearly basis or semi-annual basis, in a way that continuously feeds into the treaty. You mentioned, somebody mentioned the 1944 treaty and 1906 treaties. I think it's 1906 treaty. It actually specifies a fixed amount in terms of acre feet. How do you think that kind of a treaty that says a specific amount must be delivered from the U.S. to Mexico every year, how do you think that's going to play into situations of drought and climate change?
Like a credit card where it doesn't look at like future use or like the fact that the population could expand. I mean, just inevitably they should have looked at that.
Yeah.
That population is going to be more now, so there's going to be more demand. And like you said, the fact that it doesn't consider that there's not going to be water there.
Okay.
So if you are indebted to the other side.
Yeah. So factors of availability, how much water you have available, maybe even looking at over time and an ability to continually update the information and plug that into the treaty, how it's operating. Demand, changing demand, growing demand because of growing populations, maybe populations are moving, changes in the economic needs, and so on. Good. What other factors do you think you'll need to know before you get to the table? Yeah.
Kind of looking back at our water law course, I was thinking about Canada. Was that doctrine, that issue with a water course going, I think Rio Grande going into Mexico, and I think the U.S. thought about declaring that it was all ours. You're downstream, and we're going to take it, but then we would run into issues with Canada because we're downstream of some rivers that come from Canada to the U.S.
So what's the concept behind that?
Well, consistency. I mean, I forget the name.
Yeah, what's that word where a country decides that this is mine? Sovereignty. We're talking about international law here.
The Harmon Doctrine?
Well, that was the Harmon Doctrine, yeah. But the root of this is the notion of sovereignty. We are a sovereign country, the United States. So is Mexico. And by the way, Colorado, New Mexico, and Texas have their own degree of sovereignty and sovereign rights that is only superseded by the federal sovereignty in the United States. So Colorado, Texas, and New Mexico are equal sovereigns amongst themselves. They're lesser sovereign with regard to the United States and Mexico, which that brings in the issue of who gets to negotiate an actual treaty. But as was said earlier, because they have water rights and the right to manage and allocate in the United States, they can wield their sovereignty pretty strongly in the United States. So the notion of sovereignty is very important here. And then it comes into play with who's upstream, who's downstream. Colorado is sovereign, and they're upstream. Are they entitled to 100% of the water within their jurisdiction? Remember, we in Texas, we're downstream.
If you believe in prior appropriation, they do. First in time, first in right. And so they're the first in time with the water.
Well, is it a first in time scenario? Or is it because sovereignty, if you think about what sovereignty means, it's you own everything in your territory and you have a right to it regardless of anybody outside. Because if you apply the notion of prior appropriation, you can argue that Egypt's going to get 90% of the Nile River, regardless of the fact that there's, 7, 8 states upriver. I just don't think that's going to fly. Certainly not under international law and between countries declaring themselves sovereign. Ethiopia, 80% of the water that flows into the Nile River originates in Ethiopia. 80%. You don't think they're going to say, hey, sovereignty, this is all ours? So it's an issue. It's an issue, and it doesn't quite work the same way that it does domestically within a system like we have here in Texas, prior appropriation, where we've created within our jurisdiction. Yes, counties are sovereign, but the level of sovereignty that we've given to our counties is nowhere near the level of sovereignty that we have at the state level, and certainly not at the international level. So the question that Patrick was posing, should the U.S. claim sovereignty, 100% sovereignty, absolute sovereignty over the waters of the Rio Grande, at least the waters that are in Colorado and New Mexico, and not allow any water to flow, or at least have the opportunity to prevent the water from flowing into Mexico?
Probably a lot of indirect effects of that would certainly outweigh any supposed benefits of more water for a few people in the Rio Grande area. versus our international relations with Mexico and the U.S.
Okay.
The first thing that comes into my mind is the potential for conflict, whether it be, military or economic or, not just with that particular neighbor, but, from the world.
Right.
And, kind of goes from there. But yeah, I think in the Harmon situation, it was an issue of, well, if we do this to Mexico, Canada is going to do it to us.
Yeah.
And then, what's going to happen?
It's precedence. If we do it to Mexico, Canada will do it to us. I mean, are we willing to take that risk? Or do we want to take a stance because of precedence and international law? Do we want to take a stance before we get to the negotiating table even, that sovereignty might be lessened? And this notion of sovereignty, it's going to come back. We're going to come back to it in a couple of weeks. So another thing to keep in mind. All right, what else do we want to keep in mind? And I want you to think in terms of territory. What other factors would come into play or you should think about before you get to the negotiating table?
They talked about it in the readings a little bit, where you consider the border on the river, whether it's, at the Thalweg or whether it's at a midpoint in the river, because where you consider where the boundary is going to change how you allocate it.
Maybe. If the boundary's at the Thalweg, which is the deepest channel, or is it on one shore, the other shore, or the physical midpoint of the river, which may not be the deepest point? Does that relate to how much water each country gets? That could be an interesting dilemma. Good. What else? What else related to that sort of territoriality aspect?
Yeah, I think we probably need to know who's using what as well as how much water's in the river.
Okay, so that's part of the demand. Well, existing uses, existing demands, and maybe future demand, projected demand. Good. What else?
You need to understand and monitor the inflow. Just if you only consider the headwater state, which is Colorado, if you don't take into factor how that the interstate stream commissions are actually balancing the inflow conditions. Mexico needs to figure out what they can contribute.
Mm-hmm.
If they're going to seek sovereignty or rights to the water, then the inflow situation needs to be addressed, and the treaties that allow that to take place would need to be adjusted for inflow contribution.
Okay. So calculating how much water goes into the system. And what if one country provides 80% of the water in the system, the other country provides 20%? Does that mean one country...
Yeah.
Does that relate their entitlement?
Yeah, if you only provide 20%, that's what your entitlement should be.
So what do you do with Egypt? They've been using 70-80% of the river for literally thousands of years.
Yeah.
And now you tell them you're not entitled?
Yeah, who has sovereignty?
Well, the question is how you define sovereignty.
Who has the biggest army?
Actually, Egypt.
Okay, there you go. Solved.
So let me suggest this then. If the water in the Rio Grande, if the majority of the water came in from the Rio Conchos, let's say 60-70%, would we say that the 60 or 70% in the Rio Grande Valley should go to Mexico?
There certainly can be a ratio established to do that. I mean, if you look at the agricultural contribution on both sides of the river, that contribution would carry an economic burden or an economic leveraging factor that could be used. But
so
to just argue...
But are you talking about water contribution or economic contribution?
Either way.
Well, because I don't think it's either way, because water contribution could be used for low economic value crops or high economic value crops, depending what the needs are of the local community. So are we going to gauge how much water a country is entitled to based on their economic value that they can produce with that water, or by the physical quantity of water that they deliver to that system?
Should we consider other water resources in the area?
Ooh, other water resources. So if one country has other water, look, the U.S. has the Great Lakes. I mean, we just need to put a pipeline up from there to Texas, right? Mexico doesn't have a Great Lakes. So should that be a factor? Okay, we don't have to go as far as the Great Lakes. The Mississippi, I mean, it floods all the time, right? We just need to bring it over here. Is that a factor? Yeah.
I was going to ask, so why don't more of these, if it's just between two countries, why don't they just go half and half as far as when the water's allocated? I mean,
just go 50-50.
And then, I mean, it hurts both sides, technically, I guess.
Well, unless it's an 80-20 split in terms of the origin of the water, and then the one who only provides 20%, you're now going to give him 50%.
But should we fight for that surface water when in the reading it mentioned about the groundwater? And then how does that affect the deal in there?
So now you're complicating this. You're talking about the hydrocycle. So we got surface water, we've got groundwater. Let's just regulate the whole thing. How about we regulate rain? Well, why are you laughing? We actually do regulate rain. Anybody know how we do it?
Diffuse surface water?
What's that?
Like diffuse surface water?
No, not even. We don't even have to get to the rain that falls on the ground. Has anybody heard of rain cloud seeding? There are some states that have regulations on seeding of rain clouds and whose water it's supposed to be. I've always found that really funny because if you're going to seed clouds in New Mexico and they happen to flow over to Texas and then rain, I mean, what do you do then? But we actually do that. And in Colorado, there's another rule that says you are not allowed to rainwater harvest, period. They now have an exception. Last couple of years, they've added an exception for domestic purposes, like for your local garden. But that's it. You are not allowed to rainwater harvest, which in effect is putting a regulation on the rain that falls over the surface of the earth, and it's already accounted for under the regulation. So we do regulate the rain in some jurisdictions. Do we want to do that? Do we want to do that on the border? Do we want to regulate the groundwater? Do we want to regulate diffused water? So these are all the other things that you have to start thinking about is, before you get to the negotiating table, how much do you want to include in the package that you're going to discuss? This is going towards what in the legal realm is called scope. What is the scope of the thing that you're going to be addressing? So, which waters, where are they coming from? What are the demands? What are the supplies? What are all these different factors? There's one more that I want to touch on, which I was trying to hint when I was suggesting territory. Anybody has an idea of what about territory could be important here, in addition to sovereignty, but in terms of the scope of what we'd want to regulate?
You mean like the drainage basin of a river? Is that kind of territory?
Do we include the entire drainage basin? If we sat in a treaty to develop a treaty with Mexico, I put aside the existing treaties, but let's say we're going to negotiate with them. Are we negotiating only about the contiguous part of the river, the part that forms the border, or do we also include the part that's entirely domestic in the United States? By the way, was it the Pecos River? That's an entirely domestic river, isn't it? Should that be part of the analysis? Well, just because it feeds the Rio Grande, I mean, does that make it a direct tributary? How about tributaries in Colorado that feed into the Rio Grande in Colorado? These small tributaries, should they be part of the analysis?
I think it probably depends what percentage that tributary is, I guess, adding to the, or I guess what order stream it is.
Yeah.
I mean, if some of the streams in Colorado.
Okay, I'll give you another example. The Gila River in Arizona. It feeds the Colorado River. It's a significant feeder into the Colorado River. The Gila River is, for our purposes, it's entirely domestic. It actually has some tributaries, really small ones, coming in from Mexico. But for our purposes, it's entirely a U.S. river. And it goes into another U.S. river, the Colorado, the big Colorado. And only, the last couple miles of the Colorado goes into Mexico? So should the Gila River be part of the treaty that the U.S. has with Mexico over the Colorado River?
Probably, if you want the full, I guess, picture of the river. I mean, you can't be picking and choosing which tributaries to include or not to include, because people will definitely exploit that.
Well,
the farmers going all the way up there and taking it out.
Well, maybe. And I mean, from a Mexican point of view, they're probably going to say absolutely all the way to the headwaters of the Colorado, right? On the U.S. side, well, what would the Coloradans say? Remember, on the U.S. side, we have a different system that leads to our international relations than Mexico does. Mexico, water management is centralized. U.S. is decentralized. So something to think about. Tributaries, groundwater, do we include those in here? There's a term that I've started seeing in international community, from ridge to reef. I mean, do we, all the way from the edges of the basins, not just to the mouth of the river, but into that estuary part where it starts mixing? How far do we want to go and regulate this transboundary river, this international river? And this is something that is to consider, because you may or may not want to include that in part of your discussions.
Why would anyone want to come to that table in the first place? I mean, how did we get that 1906? Because we were going to build the Amistad and those reservoirs on the river? Or what was the incentive?
Well, as I recall, for Amistad, you had Elephant Butte. We had flooding, and we had irrigation objectives, and we decided collectively we need to do something that will benefit us, and we also realized that it would have an impact on Mexico, so we had to have an arrangement with Mexico. And part of that 1906 treaty was we had to deliver a certain amount of water, I think it's 60,000 acre-feet, to Mexico. How are we going to deliver it? Well, we needed a collection system, and that became Elephant Butte. And so we needed a collection system where we'd collect all the winter runoffs, the spring runoffs, and so that at the point when we need to have 60,000 acre-feet available, as well as all the other water we needed available for New Mexico and Texas, well, we'd have a reservoir that has stored up that amount of water. So same thing with Amistad and all the other schemes that we've developed in conjunction with Mexico. It's self-interest, but we also realize that they have the same or very similar self-interest.
In your legal term of scoping, would that be a part of the scope of why would anybody want to join in this thing? Those conditions don't exist anymore, do they?
Well, sure, they don't exist in that sense, but they still exist because they're being implemented. So if we were going to negotiate for a new treaty, they could. I shouldn't say they should, but they could absolutely be a part. It really depends. What is the objective of the negotiation? Do you want to have it a basin-wide renegotiation of the treaty, or do you want to just negotiate some new component, some new aspect of relations because of some new pollution event or some new activity or some new objective? So it really depends. What is the objective? And then you have to figure out all these different factors and what to include. I started off with a scenario of there's no treaty, there's no agreements, let's start fresh. What do? We have interest in irrigation, we have interest in water storage because we want long-term supplies. They probably have similar interests. Maybe we can collaborate. We know that if we do it on our own, we will have an impact on them. And there's probably some obligation on international law. We haven't quite gotten to that part of the class. That we probably owe them some obligation. So we have to come to the table thinking about what are our objectives, what are the obligations, what might their obligations be to us, what are their objectives, water demand, water availability, all these things have to come to the table. Do we want tributaries to be included? Do we want groundwater to be included? All these things have to be at least considered before you sit down and negotiate. Any other comments, any other questions at this point? Because if not, I'm gonna put you guys all on the spot. Let me introduce you to a new region of the world. We've got 3 countries. Galvestonia is a coastal nation. Aggieland is right in the middle. They're kind of they're upstream and downstream. And then we have Worthland, who is entirely upstream. What I'm going to ask you guys to do, and you can obviously see where your interests or where your loyalties lie here. I'm going to ask you to take 5 to 10 minutes, and I'm going to give you this scenario. We're only going to focus on navigation. We're not focusing on anything else other than navigation. This river is navigable, I will tell you, all the way up into Worthland, right where you have that red border near the top of the slide. So it could be navigable if it wasn't for the dispute that we haven't quite agreed on who's allowed to navigate where.
What do you mean by navigable?
For commerce. Okay. For tourism, for shipping.
It's not just rafts. You can get ships all the way up.
Yeah, this is not just the beer rafts and the floating down the river kind of thing. This is
Arkansas, definitely.
Yeah, this is a big river. All right. Who should have a right to navigate up and down? Under what circumstances? All of you want to navigate the entirety of the river for economic purposes, for commercial purposes, tourism, recreation, all of the above. Every one of you wants to. Under what circumstances would you agree to allow this kinds of navigation in your collective river or in your portion of the river or segments of the river, tributaries, anything else you can think of? What are you willing to give up to get this? What obligations would you impose on those that are going to navigate up and down? And by the way, there's another couple of countries that are not riparian. They also want to navigate because they also have commercial interests and tourism interests. So I'm going to give you about, let's say, 10 minutes.
Could you define those two
work
borders?
within your own groups. What's that?
Could you define those 2 borders near the top? Because at the bottom border goes straight across, and there's 2 borders that only go half to the river.
Yeah, the border is the river between Worthland and Aggieland. So the river goes all the way, the border goes from your left up into the river, separating Worthland and Aggieland, and then if the border goes northward, I should have put a red dot right on the river there. I didn't. I'm sorry about that. But that is still the border between Worthland and Aggieland. So this is an example here of the river being mostly successive, except in that section where it's contiguous. Any other questions? All right, I'll call you guys in 10 minutes. You guys work in your respective groups and come up with what you would be willing to give up or negotiate or what rules you would like to see. We're not going to do an actual negotiation. I just want to talk this out. So, get to it.
Did anybody anybody draw it?
I think I drew most of it.
Because there's a weird part of that river where we share.
Hey guys, everybody might want to mute their microphone, but I will wave my arms and hands. Hopefully the College Station tech guys will see me when the 10 minutes is up.
Can you leave the document up? Can you leave the map up, please?
It is up.
Okay,
can you see it?
It was off.
All right, I think we're ready over here. Everybody ready?
Ready in Galveston.
College Station?
Yeah.
All right. All right, I'm gonna ask Worthland to start off.
So I'm discussing what we would do, how we would approach the negotiations. Is that right? Or
Yeah. How would you approach the negotiation? What would your priorities be? What would you like to see happen on this river?
So Worthland's going to come to the table and discuss the various benefits to the different states in having a cooperative use of the river, to take have a cooperative responsibility in making sure the river's taken care of, and to try to come to some agreements on how to deal with some of the points of potential conflict.
Anything else, guys?
In specifics,
If you have any specifics.
we think that water quality for sure can have some offers an avenue for us all to work together, especially because we have a lot of farming and we can find out a way to cut back on our pollution, then that has benefits for Galveston and Aggie land, and then maybe in time you can see those benefits. Y'all can maybe not tax our boats that are coming up the river. A little give and take. We're cooperating.
All right. How about Aggie land?
We'll cut them out. We'll work with Galvestonian.
Well, we have several things that we like to cover. First of all, we would like to have sole ownership of our tributaries that are in Aggie land. Right? We said this?
Why is that?
Because of sovereignty. You say sovereignty. Because of sovereignty.
Okay.
Is that word even?
All right, good. So
we would also like
so-
access through Gastonia. We believe that, something, I mean, it's so hard because there's no factors. Worthland, you don't know if you have farming because we have no factors like incorporated with what we have.
Farming.
So I just want to, we thought about that, like all the different factors, but we can't think about them because we just want to know navigable.
Yep.
We would like to negotiate with Galveston first. That's all we have to say.
Oh, so you would prefer to segment this and have separate negotiations with Galveston versus Worthland?
Yeah, we'll have lunch. We'll have lunch with them and then have dinner with all three or something.
Okay. All right. Galveston, what do you think? Galvestonia.
Okay, George, give it to him.
Well, the first thing that we're going to do is assume that we have rational and reasonable governments in each of these three entities.
It's a bad assumption.
Then the second assumption is that we are going to concentrate on primarily navigation and not any other issues. All right?
Yes.
That's important. Once that's done, then we would expect those rational governments to meet together and form a treaty. That treaty would apply to what the intended use of that particular navigable waterway would be. Once the treaty was put together, then a river authority would need to be formed to manage the various aspects of the three entities that put the treaty together. Once the river authority was formed, then a navigational district would have to be established for each of the three segments of the river. Once the navigational district was formed, then the environmental side plus any sort of interrelated interstream conflict would be managed by the navigational districts pertaining to tolls, use fees, environmental impounding fees, anything that involved the actual structure of the waterway and its resources.
And so you're going to create this
keeping the channel.
this commission. You want to create this commission. This is a Pan River Commission.
Yeah.
Yes.
And you're going to give it some kind of authority.
Yeah.
To make
the
decisions.
The river authority would act based on the defined treaty. The river authority would carry out the preamble of the treaty. Each navigational district would then be responsible to ensure that the environmental impact as well as the structure of the waterway was maintained. The three entities together would then have a vote as to toll, use, and support of the waterway.
Okay. Who would pay for this commission?
Which commission? Which commission?
You said that there's a Pan River Commission. It has three components. So, I mean, does each pay for its own component?
No. The river authority establishes the taxing entity by which use fees are collected and appropriated.
Who would decide?
So if you put work.
Who would be on the river authority, and how would we decide who is on the river authority? Is it equal? Are there equal representatives from each nation, or how does that work?
Yeah,
Or do you do it by population? Because say Aggieland has more population than Worthland on the river, riparian population.
Let's put our next meeting.
You can use a percentage distribution, whatever you want to allocate, just so that the whole premise is that you have a governance that's already set up. If you don't have a governance, none of this will work.
Okay, but I guess the question is going to be, are you as a country willing to give up your right to manage the portion of the river that's within your territory to some extra governmental authority? So, for example, would you be willing to create that kind of a commission on the Rio Grande River and give that commission an authority to make decisions on how water in the Rio Grande is going to be used?
I think that would be a step in the right direction to form a commission to regulate that. Anytime that you have a commerce question involved, if you have an authority and then you have the right or the jurisdiction to exercise control over that, then it becomes a matter of use fees, participation fees. I mean, all of those systems work together provided that you have the governance to make it work.
Okay, and then back to the question that from College Station in terms of who's on this commission. Let's say that Aggieland has 4 times the population of Galvestonia. Do you have equal representation on this authority, or do you do it based on percentages of population? Do you do it based on expected economic impact? How do you decide on this authority?
Revenue in versus expenses out. Whoever produces the money has the vote.
Well, I think since we're talking mainly about the river, I think you have to break it down and have equal representation where it's one state gets one vote, and then if those states decide to work together, I mean, because anytime you start doing percentages and stuff, then that's not really going to be very beneficial for cooperation.
Think about the International Boundary Waters Commission between U.S. and Mexico. Because the U.S. has a far bigger economic might and impact through the Rio Grande, You think Mexico's willing to take a lesser role on the management of the Rio Grande?
At budget time, you'd be able to sort that out. Who's going to make the most contribution to the welfare or the upkeep of that system?
Okay.
If you don't put money into it, then you don't have a voice in it.
Well, this is the okay, let me give you one more scenario. Worthland has a small population, small economic might.
We're geographically blessed.
And okay, what was that?
So we're geographically blessed.
Geographically
So
blessed.
what do you think? What do you think realistically? What do you think a country might do?
Well, if y'all decide to circumvent us, we can put the Miller Dam right on top of the river and prevent, I guess, whatever non-tributary, whatever, dam up all the tributaries besides the ones from Aguilar.
I guess going back to your original statement about having you didn't use the word responsible. What was the word you used in terms? Rational country.
Rational.
Yeah.
So
show me a rational government around the world.
If the scenario is that Worthland has a small economic might and smaller population, then we can we assume that Aguilar is a tier above them because we have more land, more population?
Well, I gave you
you gave a scenario without even including the other two guys.
No, but I gave you the scenario that Aggieland has 4 times the population of Galveston. I just made this up recently. So Aggieland has 4 times the population of Galveston, and Worthland has even a smaller population and smaller economic might.
Okay.
But they are blessed geographically on the river.
Yes, they are.
Where do we go with this?
So what I think we were talking about before was that we'll give some incentive to Worthland because, of course, we need those headwaters to come downstream, and then that we will have a little bit more discussion with Galveston, but because since Worthland is the smaller district, I mean, all we're going to do is I think what we talked about. I'm trying to speak for 10, but all we talked about was making sure that if we had that headwater flow, that we could incentive that with Worthland. Maybe we can design something with Galvestonia to contribute that together and making sure that, you know, the headwaters will come through. Yeah, so that's it.
Good. No, but this is an example. I mean, this is bringing the question of who's a rational actor. And I don't know if a rational actor exists outside of a classroom. Even if you're talking about Europe, where they seem to be friendly with each other, some countries act in ways that are not always rational, at least in the classroom sense, in the theoretical sense. And so trying to decide what are the priorities and what are the interests, what are the resources, what are the abilities, what's the knowledge base of each of these actors makes it very difficult. And then you have to bring in the question, because one country is lesser economically or lesser in population or lesser in one way, does that make them lesser at the table, lesser in the outcome? So should Egypt, with this massive military and 4,000 years of historical use of the Nile River, be considered greater or lesser than Ethiopia, which doesn't have the military and doesn't have this tremendous historical use, but 80% of the water originates in Ethiopia? So how do we deal with those kinds of factors? Is it purely an economic issue? What about the cultural issue and the social issues and the other aspects of water, the value of water? We talked about being able to value water in dozens of different ways. What about human needs? We in the United States can put water on the Rio Grande to a far better use, at least economically speaking, than the Mexicans, right? I mean, we'll put it to more high value crops than they do. They'd waste it on subsistence crops, right? That's a waste. Yeah? What about the human right to water? How does that fit into this whole scenario? Yes.
That was actually initial part of our discussion, because we said we needed, for this particular purpose, to disassociate the human need for water and, like the World Health Organization statement, that everyone has a right to access to clean water and sanitation. Separate that from navigation, because the dimensions of your discussion are going to be totally different.
Yeah. Well, let me put a twist into that, because I think it was Aguilan that suggested they don't want the tributaries to be a part of this.
We didn't either. We didn't say anything about the tributaries.
Okay.
It's a channel.
Good.
We're talking about the channel.
We were talking.
Solely for navigation. Good.
Right.
But let me ask you a question. Does that mean that any country can completely block off the tributary and not allow any water to flow into that main channel?
They may be able to do that, but in the question presented to us, it was about navigation, if you will recall.
But
we can have the court.
If you take the water, if you dam up the tributary, then the water doesn't get to the main stem of the river, and then the river is not navigable.
Exactly.
Yeah, but you need to get down here.
But the question put to us was navigation for commerce and tourism, and that's what we were supposed to come up with. Our first thought was we build a fort at the mouth of the river, and then everybody would kowtow to us, and we'd blow them out of the water. But it's not these countries that are creating this. It's the Viking lines and whoever it might else be, bringing commerce in and out, and they're the ones that are paying the tab for that commission and all of these other things. They're bringing goods and materials to all three of the countries here, right? Isn't that what it is? It's not these three countries that have a fleet that hauls stuff in and out.
Yeah, but if we all block off our tributaries in each state, then there's not going to be water in the river for the Vikings to go up the river.
We are going to have, we're going to have a river authority, and we're going to have navigation districts that, if necessary, we will build water locks like they have on the intercoastal waterway to allow these boats, which bring us the money, to go up and down.
Yeah.
They do it on the intercoastal waterway.
I specifically said we're limiting to navigation, knowing that you cannot stick to navigation. Because, and the tributary example is exactly right. The comments that were made in terms of maintaining the river, whether you're maintaining the segment of your portion of the river navigable. I don't know. Nobody really went to that extent, but think about it. You've got to, isn't one of the responsible to maintain the navigability is to make sure there's no debris and any kind of floods that brings trees and other things that can be a hazard to navigation. Somebody's got to get rid of them. But then the other part is to maintain, in terms of maintaining navigability, is you got to have water in the river. And you don't necessarily have to have a dam on the main stem. You can have dams on the tributaries and affect navigability that way. So the question of whether you should or shouldn't include tributaries on a navigation-only agreement, doesn't make sense, or it doesn't. But the point is, it's really hard to stick to something just like navigation. And you'll see this as we get to some of the other issues. It's very hard to exclude some things and include other things. But it's also, I think you can see that different countries have different interests in terms of what they want. We didn't even talk about who's rational. We're just assuming that all of us are rational here, and we still had different opinions. Right?
Yeah, I noticed that no one offered an example of a rational government anywhere in the world when you asked that question.
Maybe I didn't give anybody enough time. I mean, I'm willing to wait if somebody wants to
I think we'll be the semester will be over before anyone even hazards again.
So this little exercise, I'm hoping it kind of gets you into a sense of thinking about what all has to go into the picture in terms of trying to come up with rules and regulations. And we just try to deal with navigation in a really limited fashion. When we start dealing with non-navigational issues, just a little bit of history. Up until the Industrial Revolution, I would say 90% of treaties worldwide that dealt with freshwater resources, rivers and lakes, they were all concerned with navigation. When we hit the Industrial Revolution, late 1800s, early 1900s, all of a sudden we had mechanization of agriculture and mechanization of irrigation, and we had the water wheel to start, we started delivering water to where it wasn't, and we were able to dig canals, big canals, and come up with all sorts of schemes to bring water to places where it wasn't there previously in larger quantities, and we had new uses for that water. And all of a sudden, non-navigational purposes became paramount. And in fact, we've had thousands of years of history on navigational purposes. So most of the treaties you get today, they might recognize something about navigation, but almost as an afterthought. That's not the point of treaties today on transboundary waters. It's all about non-navigational uses. Irrigation, drinking water, water for industry, water allocation, human rights. Those are the foci of the treaties today. We had a lot of difficulty in just talking about navigation. Imagine what it is now when you talk about water for drinking for a country or water for agriculture, and how do you allocate and manage those issues? Where do you draw the boundaries? What do we do with tributaries? Well, you're not navigating on tributaries. Okay, so maybe you can argue, well, we'll include them to the extent that we need water in the main stem. But now when you're talking about water for drinking, water for irrigation, and water for industry, and all those non-navigable uses, you're now starting to think about not just tributaries, but groundwater. You're starting to think about glaciers. Think about the waters in the Himalayas and those, I think it's five or seven, I can't remember, massive rivers coming out of the Himalayas. You have the Ganges, the Hindus, the Brahmaputra, the Yellow River, the Mekong River, and I think I'm missing a couple. They originate in the glaciers, the Himalayas. Now you're starting to think about, do we now include the glaciers in any kind of water treaty? It's not been done before, but people are talking about this now, especially in light of climate change.
Yeah, I always understood that the fundamental flaw with the water law is that we don't take like a basin-wide management perspective. And so until we start doing that, then there's going to be...
Well, absolutely, but let me complicate it even further. When you talk about a basin, you usually talk about a river basin.
With the tributaries.
With the tributaries. But aquifers many aquifers follow the river basin. You have an alluvial aquifer, yeah, it's going to follow the river basin. But if you're in a karstic environment, that karstic aquifer may have its own groundwater basin that may not parallel the surface basin. And now what do? You've got sort of two basins. You may have different flow directions, you may have different endpoints, you may have different sources, but they're integrated, they're interlinked somehow. Water's flowing in between these two, surface water and groundwater. So your comment's absolutely true, but I would even take it one more step. It's not just the river basin, it's beyond that. Maybe, and I have a buddy of mine in France who did his dissertation on the law of the hydrocycle. Maybe we need to go to that level. Nobody's ever done it. Nobody's even conceptualized what except my friend in France. Very few people. I mean, do you think we could even conceptualize how would we write this into law? A law of the hydrocycle, law of rain integrated into law of water on the surface, into water flowing in defined channels and rivers and lakes, and in water in the ground and everything in between.
But you look at the map of Texas. Your point is really well made there. The rivers run north to south, and the aquifers run northeast to southwest. So
most of them.
Yeah. Majority of them.
Yeah, and it's complicated. And right now, look in Texas is a great example for my argument. We have a different surface water law. We have a completely different groundwater law that doesn't mesh at all. We do not. I think the word conjunctive management comes up in a couple of policy documents, but it doesn't come up anywhere in implementation. Certainly not in the law in terms of when we issue a permit on the river or a permit for groundwater in terms of a groundwater districts. We don't care what the impact is on that other body of water. It's not considered. And it's certainly not considered in terms of rainfall and inflow and outflow. We just issue these permits. And think about the prior appropriation system. We can keep on issuing permits as long as we want. The fact that there's no water in the river is irrelevant, because there may be a time where there will be water in the river. You just become the lowest man on the totem pole, the junior most rights holder. That's our system. So we started from navigation, and we're going to expand to navigable uses. And I want you to think about what are all the factors that we need to think about into creating a legal regime. But then, just like we had a little bit of disagreement between upstream Worthland and midstream Aggieland and downstream Galvestonia, political reality sets in. Nile River, Rio Grande River, Mekong River, you have different political interests, you have different other non-political interests that are involved. What China is doing on the Mekong, they're building, I think, 20 or 30 dams on the upstream portion of the Mekong River. They have not joined the Mekong River Commission. They are not collaborating on the Mekong, and they have a belief, and I'm not saying this is a wrong belief, but they have a belief that they have a right to do it because of the water needs of their country. Turkey is doing the exact same thing on the Tigris and Euphrates. Ethiopia just started doing this on the Nile River. You have all these other countries that have water interests, downstream interests, and they're very concerned about it. What are the rights of the downstream interests? We talked about sovereignty and the idea that, hey, the water starts in your territory, you can control it. You may be geographically blessed. Well, that's what we did. We were talking about doing with Mexico, except that then we thought about it and realized, hey, yeah, we're downstream of Canada on many rivers. If we do it to Mexico, what's Canada going to do to us? So this is something that we have to take into account and think about as we develop laws and rules and regulations on the international arena. That's all I have for today. Any questions or comments? I don't hear anything from, and the picture's frozen. Are you guys there in Galvestonia? College Station?
Yes.
Okay, College Station's still there. We lost Galveston, I think. All right. Well, not much we can do. Oh. Somebody's trying to call back in. Galveston, are you back in? College Station, are you still there?
Yes. We're here. Yeah.
Okay. Hey, has Ron Kaiser arrived or Rosario?
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, I guess, okay, so don't forget about the case studies. If anybody has any questions about the case studies, please shoot me an email. And if anybody has any other questions about today's, right now, speak up right now or send me an email. No takers. All right, guys, have a good week.